Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis or uh, some kind of hospital procedure, there's this inherent expectation of precision.
Right. It feels analogous to engineering in a lot of ways.
Exactly. I mean, if you break your arm, the X-ray just reveals this stark, jagged white line. The physician points to it, and, well, the reality of the situation is right there in front of you.
Yeah, it's a very binary system in our minds.
Yeah.
Broken or intact, diseased or healthy.
And we find comfort in that visibility, right? Because it allows us to just categorize the threat and apply a standardized mechanical fix.
Which works great for a broken bone, but the moment you look closely at the modern landscape of infection control.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that comforting clarity just vanishes completely. The whole diagnostic landscape becomes incredibly murky.
It really does.
So for you listening, I want you to picture this scenario. You walk through the doors of a top-tier, globally recognized research hospital. You're there to be treated using the absolute pinnacle of cutting-edge technology.
The best of the best.
Right. You are wheeled into a pristine operating room. The overhead lights are blinding, the stainless steel surfaces are gleaming, and positioned right above the surgical table is this highly advanced, multi-million-dollar robotic surgical apparatus.
Or maybe a really complex, life-saving endoscope.
Exactly. Visually, it looks like a triumph of science fiction.
Yeah.
But we are looking at research today suggesting that this incredibly advanced robotic tool might be secretly wearing a microscopic, functionally invincible coat of armor.
It's a striking juxtaposition, honestly. I mean, we are deploying the most mechanically sophisticated medical technology in human history.
Right.
Yet simultaneously, we are uniquely vulnerable to some of the oldest, most rudimentary organisms on the planet.
It's wild to think about.
It is, because the engineering of the tools themselves is actually actively complicating our ability to keep them microbiologically safe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today we are analyzing a massive stack of source material. We've got dense peer-reviewed medical journals, World Health Organization decontamination protocols.
The WHO guidelines are incredibly detailed on this, by the way.
Oh, they really are. And we also have infection control hazard reports, plus the actual engineering schematics of modern surgical tools.
So we have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand a very specific, really high-stakes intersection in modern medicine. We are looking at how the incredibly complex physical design of our new medical devices is violently colliding with the rise of antimicrobial resistance.
AMR, and of course the rapid evolution of superbugs.
Right. And we are moving beyond simply listing the alarming statistics associated with hospital-acquired infections, right?
Yeah, we have to look at the mechanics behind those numbers. We really need to examine the why.
The why is the scary part.
It is. Why are established cleaning protocols failing in central sterile supply departments? Why are these specific organisms surviving the absolute most aggressive chemical disinfectants on the market?
And to navigate this, we essentially have to deconstruct and rebuild our understanding of what the word clean actually means in a clinical setting.
Which is a lot harder than it sounds.
So for you listening right now, the goal here is that by the end of this deep dive, your perspective on everyday hygiene and medical safety will fundamentally shift.
You'll definitely never look at things the same way.
Seriously, you will look at a bottle of hand sanitizer, a basic hospital stethoscope, or, a complex robotic surgical arm through a completely different lens.
Well, to accurately frame the systemic threat within our healthcare facilities, we really must first define the scale of the antimicrobial resistance crisis.
Right, the AMR crisis.
Because this isn't just a localized issue or some minor hurdle in pharmaceutical development. It is actually categorized as one of the primary global public health threats facing humanity today.
Which is a huge statement.
It is, but the organisms we rely on standard medicine to defeat are adapting faster than we can synthesize new countermeasures.
And the aggregate data in the World Health Organization reports just paints a stark picture. Currently, drug-resistant infections are responsible for an estimated 700,000 deaths annually across the globe. That baseline figure alone represents a massive, quiet pandemic operating right in the background of our healthcare systems.
And while the current mortality rate is significant, the trajectory is the really critical data point here.
The projections are terrifying.
They are. The epidemiological projections suggest that without radical systemic interventions, both in how we prescribe antibiotics and how we manage environmental sterilization, that number could reach 10 million deaths annually.
Wait, 10 million? By when?
By the year 2050.
That is just, That's hard to even wrap your head around.
To contextualize that figure, a death toll of 10 million would actually surpass the current annual global mortality rate for all forms of cancer combined.
All forms of cancer combined. And the sources detail that the impact extends far beyond just the mortality rate.
Absolutely. When a bacterial strain acquires resistance, it transforms the entire life cycle of the disease.
Like it just makes everything worse across the board.
Exactly. It prolongs the duration of the sickness, fundamentally increases the window where the patient is contagious to others.
Which obviously spreads it faster.
Right. And it drastically lengthens hospital admissions. Plus, it forces clinicians to abandon first-line treatments.
Because the standard drugs just stop working.
Right, so they have to resort to second- or third-line therapies. And those are frequently vastly more expensive and carry a much heavier toxic burden on the patient's liver and kidneys.
It just creates this systemic drag on the entire global healthcare infrastructure. Bed turnover rates plummet, pharmaceutical costs skyrocket, and routine procedures suddenly carry life-threatening risks.
But to really understand the mechanics of how bacteria are successfully orchestrating this, we have to examine their primary survival strategy.
Okay, let's get into the biology of it.
So in laboratory settings, we often study bacteria in their planktonic state.
Planktonic. Meaning what, exactly?
Essentially free-floating solitary cells suspended in a liquid medium, just kind of swimming around alone.
Right, like we see under a standard microscope in high school biology.
Exactly. But in the hostile reality of a clinical environment, bacteria rarely operate as solitary actors. They rely on the formation of biofilms.
The literature on biofilms is just fascinating because it completely upends the idea of bacteria as simple, single-celled organisms just floating around, waiting to be killed by a chemical.
Yeah, a biofilm is essentially a highly organized, cooperative microbial community.
Like a microscopic city.
Pretty much. When bacteria attach to a surface, they excrete this self-produced biological shield. The literature calls it the extracellular polymeric substance matrix, or EPS.
Okay, EPS matrix. So what exactly is this shield made of?
Well, the EPS matrix is honestly a structural marvel. It's primarily composed of polysaccharides.
Basically complex sugars, right?
Yeah, complex sugars, but also proteins, lipids, and even extracellular DNA.
It's loose DNA woven into this slime.
Yep. And when a bacterial colony forms this matrix, it entirely ceases to be a collection of vulnerable individuals and becomes an entrenched, fortified position.
So it's basically a microscopic, fortified, gated community where bacteria hang out.
That's a great way to put it. The EPS acts as a multi-layered barrier. Physically, it is incredibly dense, which heavily limits the diffusion of antimicrobial agents.
Meaning the cleaning chemicals literally can't get through the wall.
Exactly. A chemical disinfectant or an intravenous antibiotic might effectively kill the bacteria in the outermost layer of the matrix, sure.
Right, the ones on the front lines.
But the molecules literally cannot penetrate deeply enough to reach the core of the colony.
And if we look at the internal structure of that colony, it seems to function almost like a biological city, right? You have the protective wall on the outside, but inside, the bacteria are packed closely together in this microenvironment.
And that close proximity is key because it actually facilitates communication and genetic exchange.
Okay, this is where it gets crazy. Since we're dealing with a sophisticated listener who understands the basics of bacterial mutation, we can really look at the specific mechanism the sources highlight here, which is horizontal gene transfer.
Right. They aren't just waiting for random generational mutations to happen over time. They're actively swapping genetic material.
Like swapping how to beat antibiotics cheat codes.
Yes, literally. The density of the biofilm is the catalyst for horizontal gene transfer. Because the cells are in such close physical proximity, they can utilize mechanisms like conjugation.
Conjugation, that's when they connect to each other.
Exactly. Two bacteria form a physical bridge and pass a plasmid, which is a tiny piece of DNA containing resistance genes directly from one cell to another.
Wow.
It's highly efficient. If one single bacterium in that biofilm develops a resistance mechanism against a specific antibiotic, it can rapidly disseminate that genetic instruction manual throughout the entire community.
It is terrifyingly efficient.
Yeah.
But what about the bacteria deep inside? The sources mentioned they go dormant.
Yes. The environment deep inside the EPS matrix is resource scarce. Oxygen and nutrients don't penetrate well down there. Consequently, the bacteria in the deepest layers enter a state of dormancy. Their metabolic processes slow down significantly.
And that dormancy is actually a brilliant defense mechanism against our primary medical weapons, isn't it?
It absolutely is. because most of our antibiotics are designed to interrupt active cellular processes.
Right, like penicillin.
Exactly. Penicillin targets the synthesis of the bacterial cell wall during replication. But if the bacteria deep in the biofilm are metabolically inactive, if they aren't building cell walls or replicating at all, the antibiotic has no process to disrupt.
So the drug simply washes over them, completely ineffective.
Yep. Those dormant cells are referred to as persister cells, and they are the reason chronic infections are so incredibly difficult to eradicate.
Because you think you've cured it, right?
Right. You administer a course of antibiotics, the free-floating bacteria and the active cells on the surface of the biofilm die off, and the patient's symptoms recede.
The patient feels better, the doctor thinks it worked.
But the persister cells, hidden deep in the matrix, survive. Once the antibiotic course concludes and the environment is safe again, those persister cells reactivate, multiply, and rebuild the colony.
Triggering a massive relapse.
Exactly. The quantitative data on this is striking. Bacteria protected within a mature biofilm can exhibit resistance levels up to 1,000 times higher than the exact same strain of bacteria in a planktonic state.
1,000 times higher.
Yeah.
That's just wild. Now, the concept of a biofilm thriving in the warm, moist environment of a patient's lungs or urinary tract makes perfect biological sense to me.
Sure.
But the WHO documentation points out a critical vulnerability in how hospital staff perceive their environment. There's this natural assumption that a dry hospital surface, a stainless steel surgical cart, a plastic light switch, the casing of a bedside monitor is inherently a dead zone for bacteria.
That is the assumption, yes.
Yeah.
That without ambient moisture, the bacteria will desiccate and die within hours.
Right. I mean, surely a dry hospital surface is safe.
The clinical data entirely dismantles that assumption. Completely. Biofilms are remarkably adept at surviving on seemingly barren, dry surfaces.
How?
Well, the EPS matrix acts as a hydrogel. It traps microscopic amounts of moisture and protects the internal cells from complete desiccation.
So they basically bring their own water supply.
Essentially, yes. And the survival metrics detailed by the WHO are alarming. Consider Acinetobacter baumannii, an opportunistic pathogen notorious for colonizing intensive care units.
Okay. How long can that survive on a dry surface?
Depending on the environmental conditions, A. baumannii can remain viable on a dry hospital surface for a period ranging from 3 days to over 5 months.
5 months. Wait. A 5-month survival window on a dry surface means that a contaminated surface could theoretically infect a patient who is admitted 2 whole seasons after the initial contamination occurred.
Exactly, and the timelines extend even further for other pathogens. Escherichia coli, or E. coli, has demonstrated the ability to survive on dry surfaces for up to 16 months.
16 months for E. coli.
And various Klebsiella species can remain viable for up to 30 months.
30 months. That is 2.5 years of sitting dormant on a high-touch surface, fully capable of reactivating and causing a severe, potentially drug-resistant infection the moment it comes into contact with a vulnerable patient.
It's a huge blind spot in infection control.
This data requires a complete reevaluation of the physical space within a clinical setting. I mean, the WHO training manuals explicitly map out the geography of these high-touch transmission vectors.
Right. It's not just the surgical instruments we have to worry about.
No. It is the call bell resting on the patient's pillow, the handles of the transport wheelchair, the touchscreens on the ECG carts, and the keyboards on the mobile computer stations the nursing staff use to input charts.
Everywhere, basically.
Yeah. If a healthcare worker touches a contaminated call bell that hasn't been properly disinfected and subsequently adjusts a patient's intravenous line, that biofilm has secured a direct physical bridge into the patient's vascular system.
And the specific organisms that dominate these environmental reservoirs are collectively categorized under the acronym ESCAPE.
ESCAPE, right. E-S-K-A-P-E.
Correct. This group includes Enterococcus faecium, Staphylococcus aureus, Klebsiella pneumonia, Acinetobacter baumannii, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and various Enterobacter species.
A real rogues gallery of pathogens.
Truly. These pathogens are specifically monitored because they possess 2 critical traits. First, they are highly virulent, meaning they cause severe disease. And second, they demonstrate a profound ability to acquire and share resistance genes against our strongest broad-spectrum antibiotics.
So they hit hard and they're incredibly tough to kill.
Exactly. They are the primary drivers of healthcare-associated infections, or HAIs.
And the sources also make a point to highlight that this isn't strictly a bacterial crisis, right? We are seeing the exact same evolutionary arms race in fungal pathogens.
Yes, Fungi are adapting too.
Candida auris is a multi-drug-resistant fungus that has triggered intense concern in global health networks. The literature emphasizes that C. auris is capable of forming dense biofilms on clinical surfaces that show a massive structural resilience to the standard quaternary ammonium disinfectants that hospitals use for routine environmental cleaning.
So the standard cleaning chemicals just don't work.
Right. The chemicals are applied, the surface looks visibly clean, but the fungal biofilm remains intact and infectious.
It's incredibly deceptive. So when you synthesize these data points, the broader reality of the infection control landscape really comes into focus.
It paints a pretty grim picture.
Our healthcare facilities are populated by patients with compromised immune systems or surgical wounds. Simultaneously, the environment is populated by pathogens that have evolved to construct impenetrable physical shields, engage in rapid horizontal gene transfer to share resistance mechanisms, and endure extreme desiccation on dry surfaces for months or even years.
So that is the baseline threat level. The enemy is entrenched.
Very entrenched.
So we have established the biological sophistication of the enemy. Now we have to look at the tools we use to treat the patients and fight these pathogens. This leads us to the physical engineering of modern medical devices.
This is where things get really complicated.
Yeah, and based on the hazard reports and engineering breakdowns in our sources, it appears the drive for cutting-edge medical capability is actually inadvertently engineering a massive vulnerability.
Yeah.
Well, there is a specific evaluation published in the journal Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology, analyzing the newest generation of robotic surgical tools. The authors concluded that the complex instruments used for robotic-assisted surgery are, and I quote, virtually impossible to completely clean.
Finding the phrase virtually impossible in a peer-reviewed medical evaluation of sterilization protocols is deeply concerning.
It's alarming.
To comprehend the mechanics of that failure, we have to look at the industrial design trends in medical technology right now.
Okay.
Device and medical equipment manufacturers are currently directing billions of dollars in investment capital toward developing a new generation of sophisticated diagnostic and surgical equipment.
Right, because we want the best tech.
Exactly. This includes advanced laparoscopes, colonoscopes, arthroscopes, and intricate robotic surgical platforms. The overarching goal here is to enable minimally invasive procedures.
Which, to be fair, the clinical intent behind minimally invasive surgery is overwhelmingly positive.
Oh, absolutely. Smaller incisions mean reduced blood loss, decreased postoperative pain, and significantly faster patient recovery times.
But to achieve that, engineers have to shrink the mechanical capabilities of human hands down to the millimeter scale.
Right, they have to miniaturize everything.
They design these incredibly intricate, articulating robotic claws, forceps, and cameras that operate at the end of long, flexible shafts.
The engineering is brilliant for the surgeon, but it is an absolute logistical nightmare for the Central Sterile Supply Departments, or CSSDs.
And these are the specialized technicians tasked with decontaminating every reusable tool in the hospital, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the fundamental issue is that, unlike a traditional stainless steel scalpel, which is a solid, non-porous object that can be easily wiped and subjected to high-pressure steam, these advanced robotic instruments cannot be easily disassembled.
They're built like Swiss watches.
Exactly. They possess highly complex internal architectures. They feature narrow lumens, which are essentially microscopic internal tubes for passing wire or fluid. They have microcavities, threaded internal screws, tiny hinges, and internal tungsten cables operating on microscopic pulleys.
Microscopic pulleys inside a tube that goes into a human body.
Yes.
The physical reality of cleaning these devices is where the system completely breaks down. The CSSD technicians use specialized, long-handled brushes to manually scrub the internal channels of these devices.
Right.
But a brush, no matter how well designed, cannot maneuver around a 90-degree internal angle, nor can it reach deep into a microcavity behind a pulley system.
It's physically impossible.
The structural complexity of the device physically obstructs the mechanical cleaning action. It's an engineering paradox, really. The tool is too small and complex for human hands to clean the internal mechanisms that replace human hands in surgery.
And because the physical brushing action is impeded, organic contaminants are left behind.
Ew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
During a procedure, the instrument is submerged in the human body. Blood, sputum, lipids, tissue fragments, and bone dust are forced into those moving parts and blind alleys.
So they just get packed in there.
Exactly. The accumulation of organic material inside these complex, reusable instruments is such a pervasive issue that the ECRI Institute, which is an independent organization that rigorously evaluates medical technology safety, consistently ranks inadequate cleaning of complex tools as a top 10 health technology hazard.
A top 10 hazard globally.
Yes. Their reports specifically highlight the dangers associated with flexible endoscopes, cannulated orthopedic drills, and arthroscopic shavers.
The focus on flexible endoscopes in the literature is particularly intense, likely because they have been directly implicated in several high-profile outbreaks of drug-resistant infections.
They are a known major risk.
If we break down the anatomy of a duodenoscope, for example, it becomes clear why they are such a liability. It's a long, flexible tube containing fiber optics, camera wiring, and multiple working channels that must navigate deep into the gastrointestinal tract.
And endoscopes represent a unique challenge because they are highly heat sensitive.
Right, you can't just boil them.
Exactly. You cannot place a complex endoscope into a standard steam autoclave. The extreme heat and pressure required for total sterilization would instantly melt the polymer casing and completely destroy the delicate internal electronics.
Well, what do they do?
Therefore, the decontamination process relies heavily on chemical disinfection. But here is where the biology of the biofilm intersects with the engineering of the tool.
Okay, this is the collision we talked about in the intro.
Exactly. If a patient's bodily fluids leave behind E. coli or Klebsiella inside the narrow, dark internal lumen of that endoscope, and a biofilm forms, it creates an impenetrable layer of mucus inside the tube.
Right, that EPS matrix.
The technician flushes the channel with high-level chemical disinfectants, but the liquid simply glides over the surface of the EPS matrix.
Because it's a hydrogel field.
Right. The chemicals exit the tube, the technician logs the device as clean, but the persister cells within the biofilm remain viable and ready to infect the next patient.
This is terrifying. So to understand the procedural framework hospitals use to actually mitigate this risk, we have to look at the Spaulding classification system, which is heavily featured in the WHO decontamination guidelines.
The Spaulding system is crucial here.
Rather than just listing out categories, let's trace the logic of how a hospital determines the specific destructive force required for different tools based on where those tools go inside the human body.
Well, the Spaulding classification is the foundational logic of clinical decontamination. It basically operates on a sliding scale of risk based on the specific tissue the device will contact.
Okay.
If we consider a surgical implant, a cardiac catheter, or the jaws of a robotic surgical arm, these are classified as critical items.
Critical. Got it.
Their function requires them to physically bypass the body's primary defenses, the skin and the mucous membranes, and enter normally sterile tissue or the vascular system.
Right, directly into the bloodstream.
Because they're introduced directly into the bloodstream or deep tissue, the margin for error is exactly zero. They demand absolute sterilization.
And the clinical definition of sterilization is absolute. It isn't just a heavy cleaning. It is a scientifically validated process designed to obliterate every single form of microbial life on the object, including highly resilient bacterial spores, which are the benchmark for thermal resistance.
Exactly. Moving down the risk matrix, we have semi-critical devices.
Okay, what falls under that?
These are instruments like the flexible endoscopes we just discussed, alongside laryngoscopes used for intubation and respiratory therapy equipment. These items come into direct contact with mucous membranes or non-intact skin.
So they don't go into the blood, but they go into sensitive areas.
Right. The Spaulding system dictates that these require, at a minimum, high-level disinfection. This process is rigorous enough to destroy vegetative bacteria, mycobacteria, fungi, and lipid viruses, but crucially, it may not eliminate all bacterial spores.
But it's the best we can do without melting the tool.
Yes. It is the highest level of decontamination achievable without the destructive heat of an autoclave. Finally, non-critical items like blood pressure cuffs, stethoscopes, or bedpans only contact intact, healthy skin.
And intact skin is a pretty good barrier.
It's a highly effective barrier to most pathogens. So these items only require low-level disinfection to remove visible organic soil and reduce the surface microbial load.
Okay, so the tension here is really palpable. We have critical and semi-critical devices like robotic arms and endoscopes that demand either absolute sterilization or high-level disinfection. Yet we have structural engineering that makes them, quote, virtually impossible to clean.
It's a massive problem.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If these robotic devices are virtually impossible to clean, why do we keep making them so complex? Are we sacrificing basic safety for cutting-edge capabilities? This brings us to a fundamental, non-negotiable law of infection control, a principle repeated verbatim across the WHO protocols.
Right. If you cannot clean a device, you cannot sterilize it.
If you cannot clean it, you cannot sterilize it.
That principle is the bedrock of the entire CSSD workflow. Sterilization is a two-part equation. You cannot simply bypass the manual cleaning phase and rely solely on the lethal force of an autoclave or a chemical bath.
Why not?
Because the presence of residual organic matter, often referred to as bioburden, physically compromises the sterilization phase.
Right, let's look closely at the physics of an autoclave cycle. The presence of blood or tissue completely alters the thermal dynamics.
It really does.
If a robotic tool has a microscopic layer of dried protein hidden in a hinge, that organic matter acts as a highly effective thermal insulator. When the steam enters the chamber, it hits the dried protein rather than the surface of the metal.
And the heat energy is absorbed by the bioburden.
Exactly, preventing the steam from reaching the necessary temperature to destroy the bacteria trapped underneath. Worse, the intense heat can actually bake the organic material onto the metal, effectively sealing the pathogens in a hardened shell and making the tool even more difficult to clean during the next cycle.
Because the automated sterilization relies entirely on the success of the manual cleaning, the WHO outlines a rigorous sequence of pre-cleaning steps that must be initiated at the point of use, meaning in the operating room, immediately after the procedure concludes.
Before it even goes to the CSSD.
Exactly. The circulating nurse or surgical technician must wipe down the instruments with a damp, lint-free cloth to remove gross soil before it has a chance to dry. They are instructed to apply specialized enzymatic sprays designed to begin breaking down proteins and lipids right on contact.
They really hit it fast.
And the protocols specifically warn against using saline solutions to keep the instruments moist during transport.
Wait, really? Why not saline?
Because the high chloride concentration in saline initiates pitting and galvanic corrosion on the stainless steel, creating microscopic divots where biofilms can easily anchor.
Oh, wow. So you might accidentally create perfect little homes for the bacteria.
Exactly. But despite the rigorous protocols, we are relying on human execution in a highly stressful environment.
Yeah, you have surgical teams operating under immense cognitive load, dealing with back-to-back procedures, complex patient vitals, and the pressure to quickly turn over the operating room for the next emergency.
It's extremely fast-paced.
And the hazard reports indicate that human error, fatigue, and workflow bottlenecks cause these manual pre-cleaning systems to fail at a rate of up to 7.4%.
In the context of a high-volume medical center processing tens of thousands of instruments annually, a 7.4% failure rate at the pre-cleaning stage is a massive vulnerability.
7.4% of thousands of tools is a lot of dirty tools.
It virtually guarantees that a significant volume of instruments with residual bioburden are entering the sterilization cycles, failing those cycles, and being returned to the sterile supply packs.
And when a compromised tool is used on the next patient, it serves as a direct vector for a healthcare-associated infection.
The systemic breakdown isn't just theoretical here. It drives massive clinical morbidity. We are looking at rates of central line-associated bloodstream infections, or CLAB-SIs, and ventilator-associated pneumonias, VAPs, that impact anywhere from 5% to 30% of patients, depending on the specific intensive care setting.
30%.
Yes. If a ventilator tube harbors an Abamani biofilm because the pre-cleaning failed and the chemical disinfection couldn't penetrate the EPS matrix, the machine is mechanically pumping a drug-resistant pathogen directly into the compromised lung tissue of a patient who is already in critical condition.
The convergence of these factors creates a profound systemic risk. I mean, we have engineered medical tools that physically defy our mechanical cleaning methods, pathogens that construct chemical-resistant biofilms, and a human workflow operating at the absolute margins of its capacity.
It's a perfect storm.
So, looking at this matrix of failure, a logical deduction for most people would be to just escalate our chemical warfare.
That's the usual instinct.
Right. If manual brushing isn't enough and steam is blocked by bioburden, it makes intuitive sense to flood the environment and the tools with the most aggressive, highest concentration chemical biocides we can synthesize. Just chemically scorch the earth.
That doesn't work.
No. In fact, globally, we inadvertently executed a massive version of this exact experiment over the last 2 years, and the microbiological fallout has been entirely counterproductive.
You are referencing the unprecedented shift in global hygiene practices triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mhm.
The sudden emergence of a novel respiratory virus prompted an immediate, massive escalation in the deployment of chemical disinfectants.
The scale was just staggering. We saw a boom in the industrial, clinical, and domestic use of surface disinfectants, biocidal fogging systems, and alcohol-based hand sanitizers.
Hand sanitizer everywhere.
People were continuously applying biocides to their hands, sanitizing incoming groceries. I remember doing that myself.
We all did.
While municipalities were literally spraying chemical disinfectants in public squares, it was a global surge in chemical hygiene meant to neutralize a viral threat.
The intent was to disrupt viral transmission pathways, sure, but the National Institutes of Health subsequently published data detailing the severe, unintended bacteriological consequences of this massive influx of biocides.
Wait, so the chemicals we used to fight the virus actually helped the bacteria?
Yes. By saturating our environments with these chemicals, we inadvertently accelerated the antimicrobial resistance crisis. We applied a massive, sustained, selective pressure to the global bacterial population.
If we look at the specific mechanisms driving this, we have to look past the basic concept of survival of the fittest. It's not just that the chemicals kill the weak bacteria and leave the strong to multiply.
It's way more complex than that.
Right. The research on biocides chemicals like benzalkonium chloride or chlorhexidine, which are basically ubiquitous in both household wipes and hospital-grade surface cleaners, reveals a much more insidious genetic interplay.
The core issue is a biological phenomenon known as co-selection.
Co-selection. Could you break that down?
To understand co-selection, we must examine the architecture of bacterial genetics. Bacteria possess their primary chromosome, but they also carry smaller, circular pieces of mobile DNA called plasmids.
We mentioned those earlier with the horizontal gene transfer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plasmids are essentially modular genetic accessory kits. They carry specialized genes that provide survival advantages, such as resistance to heavy metals, the ability to metabolize novel compounds, or, crucially, the genetic instructions for neutralizing antibiotics and biocides.
And the architecture of these plasmids is where the true threat lies, because the genetic coding that allows a bacterium to survive exposure to the benzalkonium chloride in a surface wipe isn't isolated.
No, it's frequently located on the exact same plasmid, physically adjacent to the genetic coding that provides resistance against critical systemic antibiotics like cephalosporins or carbapenems.
So the resistance for the cleaning wipe is right next to the resistance for the hospital antibiotic on the same piece of DNA.
Precisely. Because those distinct resistance genes are physically linked on the same mobile genetic element, often within structures called integrons, applying a selective pressure for one trait automatically selects for the other.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means that while we were all panic buying hand sanitizer and scrubbing our groceries, we might have been inadvertently running a massive global training camp for superbugs.
That's a very accurate way to look at it.
We were washing the weak ones away and leaving behind the absolute bodybuilders of the microbial world. When a hospital or a household consistently uses a sublethal concentration of a biocide, they are forcing the bacteria to retain and express that specific plasmid to survive the environmental chemical.
But in doing so, they are inadvertently ensuring the bacteria also retain the antibiotic resistance genes.
So you expose a bacterial colony on a hospital floor to a chemical biocide, and you inadvertently breed a population that is highly resistant to the intravenous antibiotics required to treat a bloodstream infection.
Yes, and the cellular machinery the bacteria use to survive these chemical attacks is incredibly sophisticated. The literature focuses heavily on the role of efflux pumps.
Efflux pumps. If we think about a bacterial cell absorbing a toxic chemical, the efflux pump functions basically as a highly specialized molecular exhaust system.
That is an apt mechanical comparison. Efflux pumps are complex protein structures embedded in the bacterial cell envelope. They span the inner membrane, the periplasmic space, and the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria.
Okay, so they go all the way through the cell wall.
Yes. When an antimicrobial compound, whether it is a clinical antibiotic or an environmental biocide, enters the bacterial cell, these pumps actively bind to the toxic molecule and use cellular energy to physically extrude it back out into the extracellular environment before the chemical can reach its intracellular target.
So as the chemical attempts to disrupt the cell, the bacterium is literally bailing the poison back out in real time. like a sinking ship bailing out water.
Exactly. And the data shows that prolonged low-level exposure to our cleaning chemicals doesn't just trigger these pumps, it forces the bacteria to adapt and upregulate them.
Meaning they build more of them.
Exactly. When bacteria are consistently exposed to residual biocides, perhaps because a surface wipe dried too quickly or a disinfectant wasn't mixed to the correct concentration, they respond by altering their gene expression.
They manufacture a higher volume of efflux pumps.
Yes, and they can mutate the structural proteins of the pumps to recognize and extrude a broader variety of chemical structures. This leads to cross-resistance, where a pump evolved to expel a hospital floor cleaner becomes highly efficient at expelling a life-saving antibiotic.
Wow. Furthermore, the NIH documentation outlines the vast environmental implications of this chemical surge. The massive increase in the use of biocide-based products meant that highly concentrated chemical residues were continuously washed down drains,
Entering wastewater treatment facilities, surface waters, and subterranean aquifers.
which effectively transformed our environmental water systems into massive, low-concentration chemical incubators.
Yeah.
This drove co-selection and plasmid exchange across vast populations of environmental bacteria, further expanding the reservoir of resistance genes available to clinical pathogens.
We are looking at a compounding systemic failure. We have the inherent biological resilience of biofilms protecting the bacteria. We have the physical structural complexity of modern medical devices preventing mechanical cleaning.
Right.
And we have our primary chemical decontamination agents not only failing to penetrate those biofilms, but actively driving the genetic evolution of cross-resistance and hyper-efficient C-flux pumps.
When you aggregate these vulnerabilities, you realize that the infrastructure of infection control is incredibly
It
fragile.
really is.
And to illustrate what happens when these specific vulnerabilities align and trigger a cascading failure, we can examine a highly detailed epidemiological case study.
The ASCII outbreak.
Yes, the World Health Organization utilizes this specific event in their training protocols to demonstrate rapid response mechanics. It is the 2019 waterborne outbreak in the municipality of Aske, Norway.
The ASCII incident is a definitive masterclass in outbreak epidemiology. ASCII is an island municipality with a population of roughly 29,500 residents. The geography and infrastructure are critical to understanding the event.
Set the scene for us.
On the 6th of June 2019, the local healthcare apparatus experienced a sudden, severe shock. Within a single 24-hour window, 10 individuals were hospitalized, exhibiting acute gastroenteritis, severe abdominal cramping, fever, and violent diarrhea.
In a small town, that's a huge spike.
Simultaneously, the out-of-hours primary care clinics reported an immediate massive spike, logging 30 consultations for the exact same clinical presentation.
That sudden localized explosion of severe symptoms is the classic epidemiological tripwire.
It is.
It instantly signals that this isn't a slow-moving, person-to-person transmission like a seasonal flu. The chief medical officer immediately recognized a spatial clustering pattern. The patients reporting these severe symptoms were geographically concentrated in specific neighborhoods on the island.
And that spatial correlation points directly to a shared environmental exposure.
Right. The primary shared infrastructure was the municipal water supply. ASCII utilized 3 distinct water supply networks. The investigation rapidly focused on water supply system A, which serviced approximately 12,000 residents in the southern sector of the municipality.
Now, this was an aging system originally constructed in the 1950s, relying on a network of 9 reservoirs.
Okay, so older infrastructure.
Very old. The critical vulnerability was that 3 of these reservoirs were not modern, sealed concrete silos. They were unlined mountain caverns.
Wait, literally just caves.
They were essentially raw rock caves utilized for storing treated drinking water.
The epidemiological investigation eventually identified the specific pathogen as Campylobacter, a highly virulent bacterium responsible for severe gastrointestinal disease. But the value of this case study in the WHO literature isn't the specific pathogen.
No, it is the rigorous procedural breakdown of the response.
Right. The WHO outlines a strict 10-step approach to outbreak management, and analyzing how ASCII navigated these steps reveals the exact same pressures faced by a hospital infection control team dealing with the contaminated surgical tool.
The initial phase, step 1, is to formally detect and confirm the outbreak. Public health officials must rapidly analyze the surveillance data to definitively prove that the spike in cases exceeds the baseline seasonal expectation.
Ruling out statistical anomalies or sudden changes in reporting protocols.
Exactly. In ASCA, the sheer volume of acute hospitalizations in 24 hours provided immediate confirmation. Step 2 requires the immediate assembly of a rapid response team, or RRT.
And the literature emphasizes that step 2 is often where the system experiences the most friction.
No, massive friction.
Because assembling the RRT requires immediate frictionless communication across fundamentally different bureaucracies. You have the local clinical physicians treating the patients, the municipal water authority managing the infrastructure, the food safety regulators, and the central microbiology laboratories.
It's a lot of moving parts.
And the WHO stresses that if the jurisdictional boundaries and communication protocols aren't established long before the crisis hits, the delay can cost lives.
What's fascinating here is the operational brilliance of the ASCII response. It is most evident in how they navigated the tension between clinical confirmation and epidemiological action.
They move so fast.
They did. The hallmark of a failing response is waiting for absolute laboratory certainty. The WHO training doctrine is explicit on this point. Do not wait for laboratory results to initiate the investigation or implement control measures.
Why not wait to be sure?
Because growing a bacterial culture, isolating the specific strain of Campylobacter, and confirming its presence in a specific water reservoir can take 48 to 72 hours. In an active outbreak, a 72-hour delay allows the pathogen to infect hundreds or thousands of additional people.
So they didn't wait for the lab results.
Mm-hmm.
This is where the deduction of the rapid response team was critical. They confirmed the clinical presentation in a small subset of patients, recognized the geographical clustering around water supply system A, and executed a decisive intervention based purely on the epidemiological pattern.
On June 6th, the exact same day the initial cluster was recognized, they bypassed the wait for lab results and issued a comprehensive boil water advice to the entire municipality.
That is incredibly fast.
By June 7th, they escalated their intervention, while simultaneously executing steps 3 through 8 of the WHO protocol, which involves the meticulous work of establishing strict case definitions, identifying all potential patients, conducting exhaustive interviews to map out exposure timelines.
All the detective work.
Right. They moved aggressively to step 9, implementing control measures. The water authority physically isolated the suspected high-risk node, an unlined cavern designated Reservoir X.
Reservoir X sounds like a sci-fi movie.
They closed the valves and severed it from the municipal grid. It was later determined that heavy rainfall had likely pushed contaminated agricultural runoff or wildlife feces through the porous rock directly into the unlined reservoir.
I want you to compare the town's water supply to a hospital's sterilized equipment supply for a second. The parallels between this municipal water crisis and the operational reality of a hospital's CSSD are direct and highly instructive.
They really are the same mechanisms.
We can map the municipal infrastructure directly onto the clinical workflow. If a hospital's central sterile supply department inadvertently allows an improperly decontaminated robotic endoscope to pass inspection and enter an operating room, that single instrument essentially functions as a microscopic Reservoir X.
That's a perfect analogy.
It becomes a centralized, highly efficient vector, pumping pathogens, perhaps an escape pathogen, shielded within an EPS matrix directly into the sterile tissue of a highly vulnerable surgical patient.
And the required crisis management architecture is identical. If an infection control team detects a cluster of unusual post-operative infections linked to a specific surgical suite or a specific type of procedure, they cannot afford the latency of waiting weeks for environmental swabbing and complex genetic sequencing to confirm the exact source.
They just can't wait.
They must rely on the epidemiological signals. They must immediately isolate the suspected surgical tools, halt all elective procedures requiring that specific equipment inventory, and launch a parallel, exhaustive audit of the CSSD decontamination protocols, the automated washer disinfectors, and the autoclave cycle logs.
And the ASCII outbreak clearly demonstrates the catastrophic failure of relying on mid-century infrastructure and unlined rock cavern to protect a modern population from a pathogen.
You can't use old tools for new threats.
In the context of our healthcare systems, our protective infrastructure is the established sterilization protocol. And the overwhelming consensus of the hazard reports and engineering evaluations is that our legacy infrastructure, the manual brushing of lumens, and the application of standard steam autoclaves is structurally inadequate against the modern reality of complex robotic architectures and chemical-resistant biofilms.
Acknowledging this systemic inadequacy really forces a critical pivot in our approach. If the physical complexity of the tools prevents mechanical cleaning, and our standard chemical agents are driving dangerous evolutionary resistance, how do we adapt?
Right. What's the fix?
We know that reverting entirely to older, highly toxic sterilization methods is not a viable path forward.
What older methods?
For decades, hospitals utilized ethylene oxide gas to sterilize heat-sensitive, delicate instruments. Yes. However, ethylene oxide is a highly volatile, highly toxic, known carcinogen. Its use poses severe occupational health risks to the CSSD technicians, and the environmental emissions are subject to increasingly stringent regulatory clampdowns. It is a legacy technology that the industry is actively trying to phase out.
This realization initially feels incredibly bleak, honestly, almost as if we have engineered ourselves into an unwinnable corner. However, the source material pivots sharply toward the vanguard of biomedical engineering here.
There is hope on the horizon.
Medical device manufacturers, biotechnology firms, and venture capital investors are acutely aware of this crisis and are aggressively funding new paradigms in sterilization technology. They are moving away from traditional heat and toxic liquids toward incredibly sophisticated, physics-based, and biological solutions.
The future of clinical decontamination is actively being developed, and one of the most mechanically fascinating leaps forward is the application of cold atmospheric plasma.
Okay, the physics behind cold plasma sounds inherently contradictory to me, almost like something pulled from a science fiction narrative. How exactly does a technology generate plasma, which we typically associate with the surface of a star or extreme thermal energy, at a temperature safe enough to clean a fragile surgical tool?
It sounds impossible, but the mechanism is a brilliant application of quantum physics and chemistry. The system introduces energy, typically electrical discharges or microwaves, into a localized gas flow, such as helium or argon, at standard atmospheric pressure.
Okay, energy into gas.
This energy strips electrons from the gas atoms, creating a plasma state. However, the system is engineered so that only the electrons achieve high temperatures, while the heavier ions and neutral gas molecules remain near room temperature.
So it doesn't get hot.
The macroscopic temperature of the plasma plume remains entirely safe to the touch. But critically, this process generates a massive concentration of highly reactive oxygen and nitrogen species within the plasma.
When we talk about reactive species, we are essentially talking about molecules that are chemically unstable, right? They are missing electrons and will aggressively strip electrons from any organic molecule they come into contact with in order to stabilize themselves.
Precisely. It is a process of intense, localized oxidative stress. When a contaminated endoscope is exposed to a plume of cold atmospheric plasma, these reactive species attack the microbial cells at a fundamental molecular level.
They just tear them apart.
They cause massive oxidative damage to the bacterial cell membranes, denature the critical structural proteins, and cause catastrophic breaks in the bacterial DNA. Furthermore, because the macroscopic temperature is low, this intense chemical destruction occurs without melting the delicate polymer casings.
Or degrading the fiber optic lenses, or frying the microelectronics of the endoscope.
Exactly.
The critical question, however, goes back to the defense mechanisms we discussed earlier. Can this cold plasma overcome the physical barrier of the biofilm? We know that chemical biocides essentially glide off the surface of the EPS matrix. Does the cold plasma effectively penetrate that fortress?
This is exactly where the application of cold plasma demonstrates a massive advantage over liquid biocides. The reactive oxygen and nitrogen species are highly energetic gas phase molecules.
Because they're a gas, they can get in.
Yes. They are capable of actively penetrating and chemically shearing apart the complex polysaccharides and extracellular DNA that make up the EPS matrix.
Oh, wow.
The clinical evaluations are highly promising. The literature indicates that when cold atmospheric plasma is utilized in conjunction with novel advanced enzymatic cleaners, the combined process can physically eradicate 90 to 95% of mature Staphylococcus aureus and Pseudomonas aeruginosa biofilms from the internal working channels of endoscopes.
90 to 95%. It actively dismantles the chemical fortress, exposes the dormant persister cells, and neutralizes them. And all without leaving behind a toxic, carcinogenic residue like ethylene oxide.
That represents a profound technological leap in physical decontamination. But addressing the biofilm is really only half of the equation here.
Right, because we still have the human element.
Exactly. The source material heavily emphasizes the need to mitigate the human operational element. The hazard reports clearly stated that cognitive overload and fatigue in the CSSD contribute to a 7.4% failure rate in the manual processing steps.
So how are they fixing that?
To address this, the industry is rapidly moving toward the concept of the digital CSSD.
Digital CSSD.
Heavily integrating the Internet of Things, or IoT, and artificial intelligence into the daily workflow of sterilization technicians.
The digitization of the CSSD is an attempt to engineer human fallibility out of a highly repetitive, high-stakes environment. I mean, historically, the tracking of complex surgical tools relied heavily on the memory and manual documentation of the technicians.
Right. Yeah, a technician had to physically verify and record which specific robotic arm went into which specific washer disinfector cycle, monitor the precise chemical concentrations, verify that the autoclave reached the exact required pressure for the necessary duration, and ensure the tool underwent the mandatory cooling period before being handled.
It is an immense cognitive load for a human being.
The digital CSSD replaces human memory with interconnected, smart tracking systems.
The foundation of this system is the UDI, or Unique Device Identification Barcode. Every individual scalpel, every highly complex robotic surgical arm, and every flexible endoscope is laser-etched with a microscopic unique identifier.
So it can't be lost in the shuffle.
Right. As these tools move through the decontamination life cycle from the point of use in the OR, down to the washing sinks, into the ultrasonic cleaners, and finally into the autoclaves, they're continuously scanned and tracked.
And the AI-driven analytics architecture monitors this massive flow of data in real time. The system algorithmically tracks the exact parameters of every step. It knows precisely how long a specific robotic instrument has been submerged in an enzymatic soak.
It watches everything.
It monitors the telemetry of the autoclaves, and if a specific cycle drops below the required sterilization temperature for even a few seconds, the AI automatically flags the entire load as compromised.
No.
If a technician attempts to package a tool that hasn't completed the mandatory cooling phase, the system locks the workflow. By systematically removing the burden of manual tracking and parameter verification, these digital advancements have been shown to reduce workflow and tracking errors by 40 to 50%.
50%. That's huge. However, the source material contains a very specific structural warning regarding this digital transition. It highlights a critical conceptual flaw in how device manufacturers and hospital administrators view AI integration.
Yes, this is important.
There is a significant risk of falling so in love with the data tracking that the foundational medical ethic of do no harm is completely sidelined.
That is a crucial caveat. An advanced AI tracking system, no matter how sophisticated its algorithms or how detailed its dashboard, is ultimately a logistical tool. It cannot compensate for fundamentally flawed physical engineering.
Right. If an AI system perfectly tracks an endoscope through a 45-minute high-level disinfection cycle, logging every temperature and chemical metric solidly, but the physical design of the endoscope's internal lumens makes it impossible for the cleaning brushes and the chemicals to reach a biofilm trapped in a microcavity.
The AI is completely blind to that biological reality.
Exactly. It will flag the device as clean, providing a dangerous false sense of security.
The ethic of do no harm dictates that the fundamental microbiological safety of the patient must supersede everything else.
Always.
If an engineering firm designs a robotic surgical arm with incredibly advanced articulating features, but those features create crevices that cannot be manually scrubbed, they have violated that ethic. You simply cannot patch a physical biological hazard with a software update.
Software can't reach inside a tiny tube and scrub it.
No, the manufacturers must prioritize cleanability and physical access in their initial CAD designs, even if it means slightly compromising the aesthetic or the advanced functionality of the tool. If the tool cannot be physically cleaned, the AI tracking is completely irrelevant.
Exactly. We cannot digitize our way around the fundamental laws of microbiology, which makes the final frontier explored in the source material so compelling. If human brushing is structurally limited, if chemical biocides trigger dangerous genetic co-selection, and if AI is purely logistical, the cutting edge of infection control is looking at fighting biology with biology.
Yes, the phages.
This involves the therapeutic application of bacteriophages. The concept of bacteriophages feels like a massive paradigm shift. It moves completely away from the blunt force trauma of extreme heat or toxic chemistry.
Because bacteriophages, or phages, are essentially viruses.
Viruses fighting for us?
Yes. But they are a highly specific, naturally occurring class of viruses that exclusively hunt, infect, and consume bacteria. Their biological structure makes them completely harmless to human cells, plants, or animals.
Phage therapy represents the ultimate application of biological precision medicine. When we use broad-spectrum chemical biocides, we are deploying a blunt instrument. We indiscriminately annihilate both harmful pathogens and beneficial microbes, which, as we discussed, creates the massive selective pressure that drives the evolution of superbugs.
But bacteriophages operate on an entirely different principle. They are highly species-specific. An infection control team can theoretically engineer a precise cocktail of phages that are biologically locked onto the specific molecular signature of Acinetobacter baumannii, for instance.
Wait, so instead of trying to poison the bacteria, we are essentially releasing microscopic hunting hounds to track them down on our medical tools.
That's exactly what we're doing.
But the critical test of any new decontamination technology is how it handles the EPS matrix of a mature biofilm. If highly concentrated benzalkonium chloride simply washes over the surface of the matrix, how does a virus manage to penetrate that barrier?
The mechanism of penetration is the result of billions of years of evolutionary warfare. Phages have co-evolved alongside bacteria. They have developed highly specific countermeasures to bypass bacterial defenses.
They have their own weapons.
Many phages are equipped with specialized enzymes called depolymerases. When a phage encounters the EPS matrix of a biofilm, it utilizes these depolymerases to actively degrade and chew through the complex polysaccharides.
It eats the wall.
It physically drills a microscopic tunnel through the fortress wall. Once it breaches the matrix and contacts a bacterial cell, it injects its genetic material, hijacks the bacterium's internal replication machinery, and forces the bacterium to produce hundreds of new phages.
Inside the bacterium.
Yes. This process, known as the lytic cycle, culminates in the bacterium rupturing, or lysing, releasing the newly formed phages to hunt down the remaining persister cells within the colony.
It explodes the bacteria from the inside out and sends out more hunters.
Exactly. And the clinical data supporting this approach is incredibly robust. The research indicates that when bacteriophage therapy is utilized to decontaminate complex biofilm-infected orthopedic implants or intricate urology devices, areas where chemical interventions routinely fail, clinicians are seeing a 77% improvement rate in eradicating multi-drug-resistant infections.
A 77% success rate against pathogens that have essentially defeated modern antibiotics.
It is a remarkable statistic that really underscores the power of targeted biological intervention. The phages actively dismantle the biofilms, and critically, because they require the host bacterium to replicate, they are a self-regulating system.
Right. If there's no bacteria left, what do?
As long as the specific pathogen is present, the phages multiply and concentrate their attack at the exact site of the infection. Once the bacterial population is eradicated, the phages lack a host to replicate and simply fade from the environment.
They just die off safely.
Yes. This minimizes environmental disruption, avoids the massive co-selection pressures associated with widespread biocide use, and represents a fundamental shift towards sustainable, biologically sound infection control.
This has been an incredibly dense and revealing exploration today. Let's take a moment to just synthesize the vast landscape we've just covered. We began by examining the microscopic chemical fortresses known as biofilms.
The EPS matrix.
Right. We explored how the EPS matrix protects dormant persister cells, facilitates the sharing of resistance genes, and allows notorious superbugs like the escape pathogens to survive extreme desiccation on dry hospital surfaces for months.
We then mapped that biological threat onto the physical reality of modern medical engineering. We analyzed how the drive for minimally invasive surgery has produced complex, narrow-lumened robotic tools that physically obstruct manual cleaning brushes.
And we reiterated the foundational law of decontamination. If a device cannot be cleaned of organic bioburden, the subsequent sterilization cycle will fail, directly endangering the patient.
Which led us to examine the severe unintended consequences of the pandemic-era hygiene boom, detailing how the massive indiscriminate application of chemical biocides actively drove genetic co-selection,
forcing bacteria to evolve highly efficient efflux pumps capable of rejecting both floor cleaners and life-saving antibiotics. We contextualize these systemic vulnerabilities by walking through the ASCO waterborne outbreak,
demonstrating how the precise, rapid epidemiological interventions required to secure municipal water supply mirror the exact protocols a hospital must deploy when a central, sterile supply workflow fails and an outbreak occurs.
And finally, we explored the technological vanguard fighting back. The application of cold atmospheric plasma to chemically shear apart biofilms, the integration of AI and UDI tracking to mitigate human error in the CSSD, and the deployment of bacteriophages, microscopic virus hunting hounds equipped with depolymerase enzymes to systematically dismantle the superbugs our chemicals can no longer touch.
The overarching synthesis of this material really points to a critical rebalancing of priorities. The relentless drive of device manufacturers to engineer smaller, more advanced, more capable surgical robotics must be rigorously checked by the foundational medical ethic: do no harm.
AI tracking and high-tech features are secondary.
Exactly. Patient safety begins long before the incision is made. It begins in the sterile processing department, ensuring that the miraculous tool designed to save a life isn't structurally compromised and acting as a Trojan horse for a multi-drug resistant pathogen.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative concept to consider as you process all of this information. We have clearly established that the internal mechanics of our modern medical tools are becoming far too intricate to be reliably cleaned by human hands and traditional brushes.
Right.
We know that escalating our use of chemical biocides only accelerates the evolution of resistant superbugs. Therefore, if mechanical cleaning is structurally limited and chemical warfare is backfiring, will the future of biomedical engineering require us to design medical devices that are, in a sense, actually alive?
That's a wild thought.
Imagine the next generation of robotic surgical arms not just being made of sterile titanium and polymer, but being manufactured with a permanent engineered symbiotic coating of active bacteriophages. A tool designed to actively self-clean, utilizing the precision of viral biology to hunt and destroy pathogens long before the device ever enters an operating room.